Hi, everybody. So nice to be here virtually, and I'm definitely looking forward to being there in person. Um, a little side note, not to rub it in, but I did recently get an invite to Rome, and I chose Michigan over Rome. So y'all rock. Um, at any rate, I'm really just pleased to be involved in the series that you all have, but in the conference. I've known Anna for a few years. I've known Megan for a few years as well. I want to say probably at least 10 years or more. And Jenny I just met. So I'm really excited to get to meet Jenny in person. And some of you hopefully I'll recognize, and I really look forward to meeting a bunch of new people as well. And I like to kind of share that I have this sort of distant connection with Michigan because my farm partner who helped to co-found our Zia Queenbees farm used to run Superior Honey Farms was the name he used at the time. And he was based in Big Bay right outside of Marquette in the UP. So I spent a full year up there at one point, and then we used to go back and forth for a while. And then we had one summer where it was like didn't get above 56 or something. And we're like, we can't really make queens in 56-degree weather. And so that was kind of the summer that we decided to stay put in New Mexico. But he still has family there in Cadillac area. So and also right outside of Detroit, I think it's Commerce Township, somewhere around there. On a lake, beautiful. I do really envy you all having so much water and trees because the high desert has them in a different sort of, density than you all have. But I'm going to go ahead and do screen share, and let me make sure. There we go. Um, can you see that? Does that show up?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, great. And I can share the link for this afterwards. This is actually I used ArcGIS story maps, and so it kind of has a living place online, although it doesn't come with narration, so you get to hear it with me narrating live for you. But at some point, I'll probably record myself. But I made this about a year and a half ago, and it's mainly just to kind of not only introduce who I am, but some of the work that I do, but the amazing sort of experiences that you can get by working with bees and how bees connect us across cultures and landscapes. But what I want to really say too is more of what they've introduced me to, and it's these more broader concepts of stewardship and what it means to be in a place or of a place or working in a space that is really very detail oriented. And we know that bees are very detail oriented. So hopefully I won't make people dizzy with this sort of scroll. I think what I have here, I do, is this is actually a little 3-minute video that I did during lockdown, but I'm going to go ahead and share it and let me know if you don't hear it, but hopefully you'll hear it. See if it'll play. There we go. I've traveled many a bumpy road in the darkest of nights, serving as a chauffeur to beings of sweet starlight. I migrate with them, like a shepherd, roaming with my flock of winged midwives, as a fellow follower of the bloom, a self-proclaimed nectar nomad. I was introduced to this artistic science of beekeeping 2 decades ago as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer collaborating with peasant farmers in South America. The bees captivated my curious mind, and working in an outdoor office made of fresh air, flowers, and freedom enticed my soul. My nomadic journey as an apiculturist has taken me far from where I could ever have imagined, having come from a humble home in Pueblo Indian country in New Mexico. My heritage is a mosaic of cellular memories influenced by my Native American ancestors, who instilled in me a profound reverence for place and purpose, and to pursue acts of community service. So I chose to become a bee farmer, as I wanted to continue to learn from Mother Nature and Father Time. As a farmer, I share beekeepers' voices of concern and need for adaptation and innovation to fulfill our dedication for local to global food production. Sharing their challenges, I became encouraged to return to academia to help quantify their observations and advocate for pollinator conservation. Now, as a researcher, my quest to better understand the relationship between cultures, food systems, and stewardship is at the forefront of my thoughts. Honeybees are like some of us and our ancestors, immigrants to this country. They have adapted and become the backbone of agriculture. There are distinct ecotypes or subspecies of honeybees, like races in humans. And these ecotypes carry genetic histories like seeds, which contain their very existence and memories of creation. For within each one, they have the power to nurture and adapt, and the magnificence to create life, food, and medicine for the world. One of the things I most enjoy about beekeeping is that it bridges cultures and goes beyond borders. It connects us to our origins as fellow beings of light, as a part of this land, not separate from it. This magnificence is alluring and inspires me to find and connect with bees and their keepers around the globe. I invite you all to accompany me on my nectar nomad storytelling journey as I chase the bloom, encounter cultures, and follow the liquid starlight known as honey from flora to flavor to feast. Cool. So I like to play that to the end because my mom actually did the play the flute music for me. She's a flautist or a wind rider, and she's getting to an age where her lung capacity isn't as strong as it used to be. So I'm really happy to at least have some recordings of her. Um but yeah, I actually got started in beekeeping as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I owe that actually to my mom, who grew up in southern New Mexico and had one it was one of two children out of five. She had four siblings. She was the fifth. So her eldest brother and her were the only two to actually go to college. And actually really wanted to study math, but at the time was told that women don't do math. And so she majored in English. But she ended up doing Peace Corps and was stationed in the French Grenadines in the Caribbean, which is actually, she stayed an extra year. She was actually teaching Spanish down there. And then they got married down there. They moved back stateside. They had me, and then we moved to New York City. And I spent my first 2 years in New York City, and I don't remember any of it because I was an infant. And then when were going to have my sister, my mom decided she didn't want to raise children in the city, and so they moved back to New Mexico. But her experience in Peace Corps, I remember being a kid and hearing her when she would talk about it, that it was the greatest experience of her life. And so I remember that phrase and thinking, I want to have the greatest experience of my life when I grow up. And she didn't know until actually I graduated from college with my undergrad that I was going to enlist in the Peace Corps because of that influence. And so this is me actually, definitely a lot of pounds lighter and 30 years younger, in South America. And so I was stationed in Paraguay, and I was working with Guarani farmers who were literally only had about a third grade education because public school is not free there. And I was assigned beekeeping, and I knew nothing about beekeeping. This was also in 1997. So this was actually pre-digital age. And so when I found out that that was my assignment, I remember laughing and I was like, oh yeah, they had that question, who minds working with stinging insects? And I at the time, for some reason, I thought, are they talking about ants? And sure, I don't mind working with ants. I had no idea that that would mean bees. But I ended up just going to the library to check out books because I knew nothing about beekeeping. And so this was my first introduction, and it really became, obviously a life calling. Like, so I really credit the Peace Corps with giving me that experience and introducing me to bees. I walked a lot. I had to carry bee equipment to a lot of places. There was no bus service in my community. I mean, I have plenty of stories. A chicken got killed because it got stung too much. I remember that experience. So a lot of really interesting things I learned. But I had really started with very rustic sort of conditions. We made all of our own equipment, including our own smokers. We used to use old coffee cans and make our bellows, side pieces out of wood, and then we'd use leather to strap around it. We used machetes. We didn't have hive tools. It was very much sort of in the jungle experience. But I learned how to jimmy rig a lot of things. And so that carried on into my professional life where, you get the catalogs with all this cool stuff, and then you realize what you really need or what you don't need or what can you make. And so I really learned a lot during my Peace Corps experience. But while I was there, I actually made a really good friend who was from Hawaii. And so you can kind of see the map up in the upper right that will start showing like where I ended up. And one of my really good friends from Peace Corps had grown up in Hawaii, and her mom had a flower farm and had said, well, when you girls are done traveling after your service, because we had this whole, like, we were going to go to Brazil, which we did. We floated up the Amazon. We did a bunch of fun stuff. Very hot, very humid conditions for sure. But I decided I would, go out to Hawaii and work at her mom's flower farm. And I had no idea that commercial beekeeping was really even a thing, nor that queen rearing or breeding was even a thing. So when I was out there was when I found out about Kona Queen. And I actually ended up working at Big Island Queen first. So I credit Michelle Crones with teaching me how to graft. And then I switched over to Kona Queens and worked there for about 5 years. And then I had the opportunity to go work in Florida. I came back to the mainland. I worked at NMSU for a little bit in an office, and I was just miserable being inside all the time. And now internet was starting to come into play. And so I found this position um, listed online for a beekeeper in Florida. And so they said, "Oh, you have experience? Well, we'll pay for you to come out." And so I got to go out to Florida and um, learn more about packages and um, basically pollination services. And that's where I met over the burn pile. Does anybody recognize this picture? Um, but I met over the burn pile, I met my farm partner, Mark Spitzig, who actually grew up in Livonia. Um, his parents had a 21 cabin resort in near Topanabee, Michigan, that they ran for many years. So he learned how to fix anything, and he's a plumber, electrician, a mechanic, all that cool stuff. But he had gone to school up northern in Marquette and ended up staying there. And so we met at the burn pile in Florida, but then we teamed up and we ended up, moving bees from Michigan to Florida because that's what he had started to do. And he had actually gotten into beekeeping just as a hobby with a couple packages, a couple friends and a couple books. And after a couple seasons, the friends kind of found other stuff that they were interested in. And he went from 2 hives to 5 to then 17 units of he didn't know what, and they were swarming and swarms were hanging off the trees. And he was like, I need to go work for a professional. So he ended up going to work for a Wisconsin beekeeper, Gary Reskovich, and that's where we met over this burn pile. And Gary had invited him to bring some of his hives down over winter to kind of get a jump on the season, get some orange blossom honey, and to learn how to rear some queens. So um, Mark had the bees and I had, more experience with queen rearing. And so we teamed up. Had no idea what this sort of collaboration was going to be. I was actually supposed to go to New Zealand and I chose Michigan again over New Zealand. So, Michigan has that power over people. But at any rate, we ended up teaming up. And this year we're actually celebrating 20 years of working together. And we've moved bees between, as I mentioned, Michigan and Florida. We did Florida, New Mexico for a little bit. Then we did Michigan, New Mexico for a few years. And we had kids, and that became hard to go back and forth. And then for the past 10 years, except for this year, we've been doing New Mexico, California. And now actually, Mark took a break this year from the migratory aspect of it and is actually now thinking of going out to Hawaii to do some early season queen rearing, mainly for ourselves, just so that we have um, queens that we need to make splits, and then we can start to run our own operation in northern New Mexico. So we're located at 8,300 feet on the high road to Taos. We get a pretty sincere winter We go through about 5 to 6 cords of wood every winter. But we do get a lot of sun. So even after it snows, we get really good sunshine and the bees will still come out even when it's like 17 or negative out. And just because the solar gain is so much. So we've learned a lot at how to keep bees at elevation, how to keep bees in northern latitudes. And you'd be amazed that there's actually a lot of similarities. Our apples bloom in May and the same in Michigan. So there are some similarities that we wouldn't have expected. But this is actually part of our farm, the front door when you come in, and sometimes I'll set up a table and do some grafting, and that we have our breeders out front. My daughter actually took this picture of me when I think she was 13. Now she's 15, but she goes to an art school, so I feel like she's got a good eye for for doing some of this stuff. But I've really become a lot more interested in not just how you produce queens, also in how you select them and what are we selecting for, but really the bigger picture of epigenetics and how the environment plays with genetics. So I'm really looking forward to getting to come and talking to you all about those concepts when I get to see you in person. But for those who aren't familiar, here's a little schematic of, sort of the grafting process. We follow the Doolittle method, and so it's transferring the right age larva. Um, Over to we use JZBZ equipment, then they go into cell builders or starter finishers. That's the middle picture. You end up with these ripe cocoons or ripe queen cells. And then how you handle them, where you place them, what kind of mating nukes you use, what's the timing for harvesting. There's all these kind of details that you really can learn the hard way, what works and what doesn't. But the bees are really great teachers. And so we really follow I want to say a father time tested, Mother Nature approved regimen where we use just the natural conditions of what I call our living laboratory to test the bees. So we select for longevity, and I'll talk more about that when I get to see you all in person. But longevity is an umbrella trait and it is a heritable trait. So by selecting over time, you're going to find bees that can actually demonstrate varying traits. And so I call it the bees as seeds experience. And really the bees are just like seeds, they're containing memories from all these different seasons within them, and it gets passed on to the next generation. And so when we can find these seeds that work really well in a particular environment or condition, then we're able to help to nurture those and to be able to share them with people in other places. This is a video, it's kind of dated. It's like probably about 10 years old, but I don't want to take up too much time just showing you videos, but I'll put the link for it in the chat afterwards. That way, in case you want to check it out, you can. But yeah, there's I want to say this was actually at our old farming spot too. So we lived in Truchas, New Mexico, which for 11 years, we were at the end of like a 2 mile road and then it turned to all forest road. I like to call it the kiss of the forest where the Pecos, Santa Fe, and Carson National Forest converge. And then now, more recently, about 6 years ago, we moved the farm 10 miles down the road to a community that's actually called Vidito, and that's where we're set up now. But interestingly, it's this high road, it's an old mountain road, and there's little older communities. A lot of them are Spanish villages and even former pueblos that used to be up in this area. And this pretty much almost every little village we have a mating apiary site. So we're able to use the topography to really have more control over our mating system. And so we flood the area with select drone stock that we have. We're not the only beekeepers up there, but we're the only beekeepers who are actually producing queens. So we share a lot of stock with our neighbors and folks who are interested. I often tell people, like, we keep crouching up and up the mountain because it just would take one sort of mishap to dash 20 years of selection. But we've been pretty I would say pretty lucky in that we've maintained good relationships. We don't own any land either. And so we collaborate with a lot of community members, whether it's farmers or ranchers or other organizations, schools, institutions who are willing to share space for us to put our bees. And so we really, I like to call it community supported apiculture, if you will. This is a Michigan picture, and this is actually Mark. You can't see his face. You'll see him in another shot here, but This is actually a bee yard in Marquette that he used to have, and this is obviously a very tall colony. Um, Hopefully you don't hear my dogs barking in the background, sorry. And this is actually a dual queener. So when we were going back and forth, it was hard to be in two places at once. So a lot of times we would set up colonies with dual queens, and then that way in case one fell out during the summer there'd still be another one, but they would pack this full of honey. I mean, we'd have to get on a ladder to pull the supers off, which was pretty exciting. And I was always really amazed at how much daylight there was in the northern latitude states in the summer. I mean, it would still be light out until 11 p.m., which is really interesting. um, Queen cells, which again, these are a close-up kind of photo. But having bees in Michigan and then also having bees in New Mexico, we were really looking for stock that could handle cold weather and higher elevation, because with in the Southern Rockies, we actually get major temperature swings. So we always joke that you get four seasons in one day. So you start off in, a jacket or sweater, and then by the middle of the day you're stripping down to shorts, and then once the sun goes down you have to like bundle up again. So um it really became critical for us to find winter hardy stock, or stock that could handle good temperature swings. um and so yeah, this is sort of that bees as seeds experience, finding ones that worked well in Michigan when we were there, and then finding ones in New Mexico. And so we used to have two lines that we ran. One we called the Great Lakes Super Youper line, and then we had our Rocky Mountain Raina line. And now they're fused, because they've become one kind of breeding pool. Um, our sort of efforts really kind of brought us to varying approaches. As I mentioned, when we don't own land, we're working with a lot of other people who, in exchange for sharing space, they get pollination services. But being able to just learn from different landscapes, I also got to learn a lot from different farmers and land stewards, what their challenges were. And I really started to develop a more nuanced sense of place, right? Not only of where I was and where my bees were, but also like what's growing there, what's the soil like, and what's the weather conditions that, and how is that impacting these growers who we're working with. We used to have a grower in northern New Mexico who passed away a number of years ago. He had a really nice orchard, and he would often tell us that you know poor pollination was as bad as frost. And I'd never heard that before. But then when I started talking with other growers, they're like, oh, yeah, if we don't get good pollination, it's like you don't have a crop. And so it really helped me to start to see the importance of what they were growing and how they were growing it. We're lucky in that New Mexico is not a high production zone in terms of big ag. I mean, we're very limited water. The southern part of the state opens up into big valley, sort of in riparian valleys. But when you're farther north, it's very crenellated landscape, really bumpy because you're at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And so you turn a corner and it's a very different microclimate. And so we'd have hives that were, apiaries that were even just a couple miles apart, but the bloom times were different because of how the sun was banked on the basalt, canyon walls, or whether it was down by the river, it was a cold sink, or whether it was up on the mountain. And like I said, bees coming out in the middle of winter when you're like, hey, it's cold out, but the solar gain was so intense. So we learned a lot together about keeping bees in New Mexico. And I definitely give credit to Mark for being a part of that journey, because I even though I grew up in New Mexico, I had never kept bees here until, we brought half his flock down. So it's been great to be able to learn with other people and with farmers and stewards around, what really keeps our communities in production. And so that's why I call this sort of the nectar nomad aspect of my that's my avatar, I guess. I like to learn about different landscapes and how that feeds the bees. And in the process, you're learning about different flavors, you're learning about different customs. Here in the States, honeybees and especially our contemporary honeybees, which is what we have, those were brought over with immigrants, with people who were not sure of what they were going to find here. So they brought sheep, they brought cattle, they brought seeds, they brought horses, they brought bees. But interestingly, North America actually really did have its own native honeybee, and they call it Apis nearctica. They found fossil evidence in Nevada that's dated 14 million years old. So they used to be here, and horses actually used to be on this continent as well. And fossil evidence shows that they were actually more the size of house cats, which I think is really fascinating. But there was some type of climatic event, whether it was an ice age event. We don't know what happened to these former sort of ancestors and cousins to our contemporary bees and horses, but they've been reintroduced. And so there are some cultures that feel that there's these long-standing relationships, even though they may not have been, within a generation or two or three or however many, but there's this knowing or understanding. And I share this because I've read a few really cool stories about folks in actually in Ojibwe country, which is very obviously part of Michigan, and their belief that yeah, horses they've always had a relationship with horses. And so I like to think of that similarly with bees. Our no matter who you are or where you come from, you can trace your lineage back to some indigenous community somewhere. So we are all relatives in that sense. But even the animals that we learn how to steward, they themselves have ancestors that, have passed on memories to them. And so I really became very interested in just the differences, but also the similarities of bees. Apis mellifera is the species, but then we have the trinomial aspect, which adds on the third name, which is usually very regional. So we have like Apis mellifera ligustica, right? Those are Italian strains. Apis mellifera carniola or carnica, Apis mellifera scutellata. I mean, all of these different regional names, but they're still all the same species. And so it made me really start to see these parallels between us as humans. We're all humans, but we have different ethnicities and different races that we are, and yet we are still the same species. But within that diversity, I want to say there's a lot of cultural expression. And so I really I actually became really, and I don't like harvesting honey, but I really like collecting honey. And so I just became really fascinated with place-based approaches and with the history of apiculture, and like, how do Italian beekeepers keep their bees, or how do these other cultures keep their bees? And really learning from the past and from history as to where does that bring us now, and what does that mean for the bees that we have and in how we rear them. And I'm going to talk more about that when I come to visit you all in person. Um, Bees really are these amazing connectors, across landscapes and across cultures. The bees themselves have migrated on their own. They're still, and I'll show this in some of the slides I show when I get to visit in person, but there's a lot of sort of, I want to say, debate, but it's still not conclusive of where honeybees came from. Did they come from Africa? Did they come from the Middle East? Did they come from Asia? There's not really conclusive evidence in any one direction, but we do know that they've adapted and they moved, and then also people started to move them. And so relationships with bees and with beekeepers has had longstanding traditions. And so even in places where they may not be considered endemic, they're present, and there's these relationships that are being formed. So this is actually a picture of working with some youth in Jamaica. This is a picture. I got the opportunity to visit beekeepers in Morocco, which was super amazing. And this photo was actually really exciting because we were in the Atlas Mountains, and we got to see these really cool monkeys that live in the mountains there in the forest. There's a lot of really cool geology. And it was during the summer, it was like July. So it was what they would consider their summer dearth. And when they took me out to go see this apiary, they had said that they normally only go to check the bees at night because they said the bees were so mean. And I said, really? Okay. And so I had taken some queen rearing equipment, and I was like, well, I'll just show them like a quick like grafting demo out here, and I was going to leave them the equipment just in case they wanted to try it. And I ran to the vehicle and I took off my veil to grab the equipment and get the cups into the bars and stuff. And when I came back over, I had actually forgotten to put my veil back on. And so I started doing stuff in the hive, and they were just amazed that I wasn't wearing like a veil or gloves. And I was like, oh, these bees aren't that bad. When they pointed it out to me, I said, oh, they're not that bad. And they were like, we've never seen that. And so I said, well, why don't you try it? So they did. They took off their veils. They refused to take off their gloves, but they took off their veils. And then they were like, take pictures, take pictures. No one's going to believe that we were out here without our equipment on. And none of us got stung that day, but it was a dearth. So I feel like sometimes our perceptions of how bees are is sometimes even more rooted in our own fears or sort of apprehension, right? Like I'm sure when you're moving quickly, and they had a lot of hives out here too. So, I'm sure they could get robby at times, and I'm sure they were kind of pissy, but when I saw them, they were delightful. And so this is actually a picture with Apis mellifera sahariensis, actually. Um, what's really neat too about getting to see these different places is, of course, getting to talk about these different places with people and getting to work with people in different places. You know, a lot of I wish I could say I come from, big money, but I don't. And actually, I guess I'm glad I don't have to say I come from big money. But, my mother was a teacher. My father was a nurse. I often thought that I wanted to be a nurse because I like helping people, but I'm actually really queasy around blood, so that didn't work out. But I'm really glad that the bees found me. And what they really kind of, showed to me too was that there are ways to do things in community. So even as somebody who doesn't have access to land, and part of that is because my tribal community, which is an Indo-Hispano intertribal community, we don't have designated space. In fact, where New Mexico State University is located, that's actually our tribal lands. And what they call A Mountain or Aggie Mountain is actually Tortugas Mountain. But our community has maintained its practices for generations. And so when New Mexico became a state, we actually were the first incorporated village to become a community in New Mexico. And that was because our community is very intertribal. So folks had, by then the US government, I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but the US government had set up varying programs. They had established what they call blood quantum, where you have to be of a certain percentage to be considered, indigenous. And part of that was to help, basically either people will become inbred, which will be their demise, or people will become so diluted in their blood quantum that then they can't be considered indigenous. But indigenous and indigeneity is really a state of mind, and it's also a commitment to one's communities. And so my community, we were still very much involved in our ceremonies and in passing that. And that's one of the videos that, or one of the images in the videos I showed was of a little boy smiling. That's actually my son who also dances. And so we dance with our tribal community every year, every chance we get. So it's something that I'm really proud of, but I am also, as I mentioned, of mixed heritage. I've got Caribbean bloodlines. My last name's Scottish Irish. So I myself am definitely a product of the melting pot, just like our American bees are as well. Um, and this brings me to the flavors, right? So we each have our own flavor, we each have our own, mixture that's within us, but really being able to collect that and to be able to share that. There's a story behind all of it, and I think it can be really interesting when we learn about each other's backgrounds. And as someone who spent, close to 25 years just in the field and then went back to academia, um the we're kind of conditioned to like you're a talking head. You come up, you don't really say much about who you are, you're just talking about the facts as a scientist. But the truth is that for people to connect with your work, they want to hear your story, they want to hear where you're from. So I really encourage folks, whether you're a beekeeper, a scientist, an aficionado, an enthusiast, a farmer, whatever your interest is with bees, don't be afraid to share a little bit about who you are, because it may connect or resonate with somebody in the room. And it can really lead to some fantastic conversations and some really interesting collaborations that you may not have thought otherwise. This happened actually with an opportunity that then took me to France. And I share this because this is actually Ketan Géant and his family ran what was called Biopic, which was sort of a play on, biopic, but they're the ones that actually had the hives on the top of the roofs of Notre Dame. And so when that fire happened, those bees all, they thought they were lost, but they had all, some of them had gathered on a gargoyle. And I actually got to go visit those beehives. It was very surreal. It was a rainy day and the bells were tolling and these gargoyles are like hanging over the hives. It just seemed straight out of a movie. And I got what they called the BIP treatment because instead of having to wait in the long line to get into Notre Dame, they took me back through the clergyman quarters, and so we like got to skip the lines, and it was just incredible. But Kenton actually moved to the States and had worked in California for a little bit, trying to start, like a an American branch of BOPIC. But then he kind of switched gears, very used to urban beekeeping, and so now actually Kenton works for one of the companies that actually does rooftop beekeeping in the cities and is based out of Denver, Colorado. So I share his story a little bit because you wouldn't think that when you see this photo, like what, they're in Colorado, but bees can take us all over the world. And I think that that's what's really kind of fascinating, getting to meet beekeepers in Italy. And this was a trip I got to do focused more on queen producers. And so seeing these places and meeting these beekeepers who are in these communities that have really long-standing traditions with breeding programs or establishing stock and sharing stock with their neighbors, it just really was very inspiring to me and something that I wanted to try and I wouldn't say replicate back here, but to see like, well, what is it that we do in the States and what is it that could help beekeepers? And so I share this because this is actually what really helped to inspire the start of what we call the Adaptive Bee Breeders Alliance. And I'll talk to you all more about that when I get to see you in person. So, as I mentioned, I was in the field for about 25 years, just working basically, working 8 years for other beekeepers, realizing that, I was going to continue to learn from bees, like there's not really an end point. And so never thought I'd be my own, farm owner. But, once I teamed up with Mark, who was a bread maker, was a boat maker, I mean, all the bees, he had done it. But, I realized that I was having these experiences and seeing how bees behave in these different places. And it brought forth a lot more questions that I really wanted to understand more on a biological level. Like why do they behave differently? Why are there different ecotypes or subspecies? Like how did that happen? How does that come to be? And so I recognized that, through my farm I could learn, so much, but that I really wanted to go back to school so I could learn from a team and also from an institution that had a lot more infrastructure than my farm. And so in 2017, at the age of 45, I enrolled at Washington State University and embarked on getting a master's degree. And I looked at mating behavior of different subspecies of honeybees, utilizing RFID or radio frequency identification. I'm not an engineer, so a lot of lessons learned for me on just how that all works. I got to work with some undergraduate students, two different teams during my time there. And we basically, I learned basically again how to troubleshoot, how to jimmy rig, but how to do so with like rhyme and reason, and learning basically really just how detail oriented science is. So I came out of that experience with a newfound appreciation for not only bee science, but bee scientists and just how nuanced and detail oriented. And a lot of times, the publications that you get to read are sort of after all of this trial and error and all of these sleepless nights and headaches that you go through. And so it really gave me a more profound sense of respect for the process. But it still didn't answer all my questions because what I realized that I was kind of missing was the cultural component. Like, okay, I'm looking at these different subspecies. I'm putting tags on drones and queens, which let me tell you, that's a whole process too. And you have to rear them all in the same cell builder and you have to emerge, once they emerge out, you have to tag them all like one right after the other because you're trying to eliminate variables. You could even see, I'll show you here, like the mating nuke boxes I use, they look all the same, but I had designs on the top and designs on the landing board so that they wouldn't drift so much, just so many details that I learned about. I also learned that when you plug something in, make sure nobody unplugs it. And then when I got an additional support from California State Beekeepers, we were able to make some of them solar powered, but then you have to worry about shade from tall trees, like just so many things that you wouldn't necessarily think would be an issue. You figure it out. So, but learning that about them, I realized that it was still this cultural component and the sort of fellowship and the stewardship of bees that I really appreciated. And part of it really goes back to my Peace Corps experience where I'm working with these farmers who don't have advanced degrees, but they knew so much. They knew so much more than, at that point in time, my little 4-year degree in philosophy person knew, like, and I realized that I knew nothing and I really needed to learn more from the world and from living in the world. And so for me, farmers and land stewards are just as important and just as knowledgeable and even more knowledgeable than those who just have the book smarts, And so I think it takes really both of those aspects to really help to better understand. And so I often tell folks, don't be afraid of the science, but also don't be afraid of the labor and of the work involved. Like that's how you can get a more comprehensive picture or experience to understand something. And that's also very much rooted in my own experience as a mixed race person who identifies as indigenous, who's grown up in indigenous communities, that, you know, my belief system is not necessarily going to be the same as everybody else's, but I don't have to ignore it and I don't have to suppress it. I can carry it forward with me, right? It's part of my story. It's part of my ancestral lineage. And so I realized that, the stewardship aspect of it and I can't speak for all Indigenous peoples, but I can share that many Indigenous communities will have these shared worldviews of interconnectedness and seeing plants and animals and the elements as our kin or as relatives. And that's really where I'm at now, is I'm in a point where I can synthesize some of the science and some of the cultural and some of the emotional aspects of apiculture to sort of fuel my curiosity into figuring out how and why. And it's not like there's one final answer, but getting to interact with beekeepers from around the world, learning what some of their challenges are, being able to speak and share at least my own experiences, and to hear others sharing theirs. I mean, it's just, I'm still learning. I consider myself a student for life of this craft. When I finished my Washington State University a Master of Science degree, which was I got interrupted slightly by the pandemic, but also I, as a non-traditional quote unquote older student, it made me realize that I wish I had done it when I had had more brain cells, for one, but for two, there was still so much more to learn, and so I actually applied for a Fulbright fellowship and was chosen to go to Spain. And I had applied for this additional enhancement award through National Geographic, which was really awesome because it gave me the opportunity to connect with Spanish beekeepers, and not just to go there, but to actually stay there for 9 months. Sadly, it was interrupted by the pandemic, but these were some of the Spanish beekeepers I got to work with. Antonio, and this is Francisco, and I just know his name right here in the blue shirt. It's escaping me right now. I'll remember. But they were all from Andalusia, or the southern part of Spain, and they worked for what's called COAG, which is Coordinated Organization of Farmers and Ranchers. And so it was kind of like a union, but it wasn't a union and it wasn't a governmental organization, but they received governmental funding to do extension work. So I got to hang out with beekeeping extensionists in Spain and got to meet over 1,500 beekeepers across just the southern part. And that really helped me to realize that, lots of different places are going through challenges. They were dealing with a lot of climate change issues. And so here it was again, like, oh, how are we going to adapt as beekeepers? Um, this is actually a photo now, kind of as a adjacent to it. But, back stateside and being interested in habitat and then seeing the habitat in Spain, I got really interested in the concept of medicinal forage for bees. We Hippocrates has said, food is medicine, or let food be thy medicine. Um, and also a lot of other communities and cultures see food as medicine. Um, I think here in the States, especially when our initial sort of, immigrant ancestors were here, they saw that, they knew that. I mean, but it was as went forward and things became more industrialized, we've gotten a little bit more separated from that. So a lot of my research now is looking at things that we haven't looked at in the same way. And that's really looking at forage. What can we learn about forage that is providing for bees and pollinators that, apart from it making us honey, like, is it actually medicinal for the bees? Are they seeking it out? And so this is research that I'm still really interested in pursuing in different ways. Working on, well, stay tuned. We're working on potentially having a conference in Santa Fe that will be looking more at phyto chemicals and just really how pollinators are using forage to stay healthy. Um, so the bees as seeds experience, as I mentioned, and I'll kind of start to wrap this up. As part of my Nat Geo experience, I made this story map to share with them. I call it Herstory since we're talking about queens, but I really wanted to go there to look at three distinct things. One was just to learn about Iberian bees, or Apis mellifera iberiensis, and them being endemic to that area and how the longstanding traditions of beekeeping were played out over time there. I mean, they used to use clay pots and or clay hives, and then also clay honey pots, which some people still made. But I was looking at the mating behavior, just as sort of a comparison. And it really also, I chose to go to Spain because, as someone who's from an Indo-Hispano tribal community, meaning a mixed community, and that's part of just the history of New Mexico in general, where we've had different cultures come in. Um, I wanted to learn more about this culture that came and, basically was not very nice to the indigenous people here, but who have claimed stake here and have also learned to live here. And as someone who has mixed bloodlines, I can't love and hate myself at the same time. I have to figure out how to reconcile that. And so I really wanted to go to learn more about Spain and the people of Spain, and then also their beekeeping, husbandry, and also how that played out culturally. So, as I mentioned, New Mexico and Spain have these connections because the Spanish came through the area. Um, being able to share with each other these different stories and these different landscapes. Some are slightly familiar, some are very different. Oh, I guess it's repeating. Sorry. Let me scroll down more. And so I really got to sort of immerse myself in their world and just learn more about what they do. I love this honey setup. I'm gonna have to replicate this, but they put a light inside to make it shine bright. Lots of camaraderie, which we find is very similar here stateside. Like when you meet another beekeeper, it's like, you found a new best friend, right? Like there's a shared interest. And really looking at beekeeping as not only an art, but it's an art and a wisdom or a knowledge base that's art and science combined. um Learning more about this is actually a picture of an Iberian honeybee. You can't really tell, it just looks like a honeybee, so you know it's not anything that's different than what we've seen, but their behavior is different. They use lay-ins hives. You can see this kind of sort of trunk style hives or chest style hives. The bees were a little bit feisty for sure. That was, I got photobombed here with a bee. And this was actually two brothers. This was Antonio and his brother, so they run their own honey business. And then Antonio is also does ag extension. Um, this is actually in a place called Los Melisos, and it's overlooking this valley that's really close to Malaga, or the very south of Spain. And so it's a beautiful spot. And this beekeeper, you can see over here, he goes by El Panadero. He's a baker as well. So most of his honey he would use for his breads and everything. They grow a lot of olives. Um, Kind of like the almonds in that, there's only olives, and then when the olives are done, there's like not very much else in bloom. But considering how many olives they eat, like they need to grow a lot. But those beekeepers struggle to find good foraging zones. And it's difficult for them to have access. And, then they try and access bioreserves or forest lands, and then they have to prove a case because they don't want to um take away from other species. But honeybees are considered endemic here, so it's not a native versus non-native situation. It's just more about shared space and having enough habitat. um this is actually a really cool apiary because right on the other side of this hill was a huge olive orchard, which was pretty cool. They didn't really use foundation. You can tell right here. That's kind of cool. But they did use their extractors could accommodate the sort of deeper lay-ins frame, which I thought was really neat. But a lot of really cool sort of landscapes. And getting to visit beekeepers across the whole southern part. This is actually a beekeeper who does a lot of wax melting for other beekeepers who would they bring him their wax and then he would melt it and press it into foundation for them, or at least wax foundation. But he shared this he liked this piece of the slab of rock because it's the shape of Spain, and he said his niece painted a picture of the what they call the man of Bicor, but it's actually the woman of Bicor. And this is a rendition of the oldest known cave painting of honey hunters. And actually, it's a honey huntress. And that the real life cave painting is located in southern Spain in Valencia, in Cueva de las Arañas, which means cave of the spiders. And it was on my list to go visit when lockdown happened. So I had to come back. I still actually left some equipment and gear there. So at some point I'll go back, and luckily beekeepers are keeping it safe for me. But it's honey huntresses that were actually collecting this honey, which is pretty cool. Um, and so, yeah, his niece had made this little rendition. He had a whole little museum. They used to keep bees also sort of like in gum hives, right? In trunks, um, old equipment. It was just really neat. Of course, anytime I saw a honey thing, I'd have to go in and explore. There was even a whole honey museum and a honey cafe, and it was just really interesting to see how these beekeepers, did their thing. And a lot of it was similar, but a lot of it was quite distinct. This is actually a picture. This is heading towards Almeria, which is really near close to Tabernas, which is where they filmed The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which was really cool. I got to go to that place. But on the way, these are all greenhouses. So what people don't realize is that Spain is considered the breadbasket of Europe. And so they grow everything from avocados and citrus to, of course, pork and honey and all sorts of stuff that then gets exported to northern parts of Europe where it's not as warm. And so almost the whole coastline, I mean, it's probably like at least 50 miles, it's just all greenhouses. And so there were I got to hear about beekeepers who were doing pollination in these greenhouses, but suffering big losses because we know honeybees they're not necessarily a good match with greenhouses, but this was the way they could get paid. And of course, climate change. So I got to really hear a lot about the different challenges that they're going through. I'm actually one of my favorite, if I wasn't a beekeeper, this was actually my first love was pottery. And so I really love working with clay. And so I got to meet and visit with beekeepers who were working with clay as well and making honey pots or making different types of vessels. And so this guy threw all of these by hand. I mean, he made it look so easy. It was so amazing. And then here's a smaller version of one of the little honey pots that they still sell. Um, and yeah, I think, I'm spending a lot of time on this just because this was one of my more recent trips where I got to spend some time. But this was the Honey Museum. They had a whole honey cafe, and they had it was tourism, so you could pay to go out and visit the bees. And the person that I went to was actually that I traveled there with was this agroecologist who was doing research on like the beekeepers and how they were adapting to climate change. And so he had never actually visited bees. So we paid for one of those little experiences, and it was really quite fun to hear how other people explain, especially in another language too, um, about bees and beekeeping. So yeah, that's a group that they also took out right after they took us out there. Um, when I was there, I got to visit with all these different bee groups, and these are different extension agents. And so I really just I don't know, it was nice to see that there was a lot of camaraderie even within the sort of technical side of things. And then even on the research side, for those who aren't familiar, there's COLOS, that stands for Colony Losses, and it's an international consortium of researchers who are all working together on bee research. And so they had a meeting in Toledo, Spain, which is a medieval city, and I got to go and visit and meet all of these European bee researchers as well. Their conference is coming up, I think, actually in November, and it's online. Just check out colos.org and you can attend the conference. I know that there's a small membership fee. I think it might be $30, but you get to start learning about what's going on in different countries. And for me, that became really also fascinating because you're not only learning about what other people are having to go through, but the beekeepers who they're working with and just how they're approaching it through their own different cultural lenses. Um, yeah. So also when I was there was a huge, what they call a huelga, kind of like a strike. And farmers took to the streets with their tractors and drove all the way down to Madrid, Spain, to voice their concerns about not having fair prices. And so this was really interesting to see as well. This was actually um, my landlord, so to speak. So he owned a big olive grove. His wife, they had raised their kids out sort of in the country, and then she had decided she wanted to live in the city. So they lived in Cordova, but he still had the olive grove. And then the small house where they had raised their kids was probably maybe 10-minute drive away. And so I rented this house from them, which I remember his wife was like so proud that it was she called it an American ranch house. And she was all, don't you guys have these? And I was all, yeah, I mean, it was obviously different than this sort of, you know, traditional old, house and hacienda, but it was definitely cute how excited she was that she thought it was very American. Um, this is actually, interestingly, this is an almond grove in right near Granada. So Granada, the city, is right on the other side, but these are the Sierra Nevadas, and so you could see there's snow, but like they still had bloom happening, and so that was really interesting to see. Um, Also getting to meet other like up and coming graduate students and getting to go to Italy and getting to do stuff with Nat Geo. For me, that became actually more of a it's still very surreal for me. I'm doing actually a presentation on Sunday with the Rocky Mountain Nat Geo Hub. And, kind of once you get you're introduced to that whole community, it's just really amazing how supportive people are because they're all about storytelling. And so for me, as somebody who loves art and loves science, being able to convey that in a creative way, I think is really what makes me more excited about the work that I do, because it's not just you're doing it to do it, but you're doing it because you want to be able to share not only your story, but other people's stories and be able to encourage folks to share their stories. So this is actually where my farm used to be. This is Truchas Peaks. We're not in Granada anymore, but this is we get glacial honey up here, and who would have thought in New Mexico you'd get glacial honey? But this is these are the Southern Rockies, and so we have everything from desert to tundra, and so there was a lot of similarities that I got to see between Spain and New Mexico. For me, as I mentioned, just having that curious mind and being able to explore, being able to learn more. This is Mia McNeil Draper. For those who aren't familiar, she used to write a lot for the Bee magazine. She's based out in California. She encouraged me to start writing, so I really like to give her some props and credit for just being a really wonderful mentor to me over the years. She's coming out with a new fiction book called The Bee Club, and I've heard it's supposed to be really dramatic. So we all know how dramatic bee clubs can be. And this is my daughter. This is part of our tribal community at one of our traditional feasts where we all eat together. This was her, I want to say she was probably 7. Now she's 15 and 2.5 inches taller than me. So she's a lot bigger than uh than um than I am in terms of her height. But she now helps me move bees, which is really awesome. This is actually a picture that George Hansen, I don't know if those of you are familiar, he does a lot with he used to be the president of ABF, and he's a beekeeper out of Oregon, but he does these beautiful encaustic paintings. And I really like this piece of art that he created because it also goes to show how you can mix different media. I mean, he's mixing pigments, but he's also mixing wax from bees and using that to create this piece that tells us so much or that invites us to think or to feel so much. And so I just really want to encourage folks to share your story. Don't be afraid of that, you know. There's all, I mean, these are just images from my farm. You know, we get buried in snow. This is also northern New Mexico. Um, getting to work with people on different things, getting different harvests, different kinds of honeys. In a good year, I can get up to 7 different kinds. Sometimes I only get 2 kinds. It's for us, water is definitely a blessing and a curse at times because when we don't have it, we want it, and then when we do get it, sometimes it's too much. But we definitely always really appreciate having water. And I wanted to share, kind of end with my logo here for the farm. Like I mentioned, we just celebrated 20 years of working together here. Um, for those who aren't familiar, the Zia sun symbol actually belongs to the Zia tribe here in New Mexico. And the tribe itself, for them, it's a symbol that means a lot of different things. And in homage to, my heritage here in New Mexico, but also to the state with which I live in, we modified ours to have the hexagon in the middle instead of a round circle. But each of the rays represents something very significant. You've got the season or directionality, northeast, southwest. You've got the seasons, spring, summer, winter, fall. Then you have the times of day, dawn, day, dusk, and night. And then you have the phases of life, which are infancy, adolescence, adulthood, and elderhood. So it's actually a life symbol. And I feel like that's what the bees and beekeeping has really been for me, is just really teaching me more about life and just all the different phases of life. And some of it good, some of it, stressful, but all in all, it's still learning. Like I said, I'm going to share this link because these are all other different online visuals and slideshows that you can check out.